Okay, good evening from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Today is the 1st of April, Friday. It's 7 p.m. Dhaka time. Good evening from Dhaka, good morning and good afternoon and good night to people from different time zones. I'm Salimul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. And my center has been running the second global Gobeshona conference on locally led adaptation and resilience, which has become a global event, which is an entirely online event, which we run 24 hours a day. Over the last 6 days, we held it. And I'll give a bit of an update on what happened during those 6 days, and then I'll introduce and then invite our two speakers for this concluding event. So can we have the slides, please? So as I mentioned, this is the second time we've done this as a global event. We used to do it as a physical event in Dhaka at my university, where we had several hundred people come over a number of days. But last year, because of the pandemic travel restrictions, we decided not to make it in person and made it an online event. And because we were online, we reached out to friends across the globe to see if they would like to join. And we got a huge response. And we ended up running nearly 90 sessions across 7 days, running 24 hours a day, with the first 8-hour time block for the Asia Pacific time zone, the second 8 hours for the Africa and Europe time zone, and then the third 8 hours for the Americas, North, South, and Central America time zone. And we went around the world for 7 days doing sessions. And it was a great success. We had people all the way from the Pacific and Australia and Japan and South Asia, a lot of Bangladesh heavily represented, of course, but also many from Africa and Europe and the Americas as well. So we have decided to retain this global conference format and keep it online completely, just also helping with our carbon footprint and not having to have people fly in from all over the world. And so we've decided to continue it, and we are now holding or almost ending the second such global conference. And I'll share a little bit about what happened over the last 6 days. So we've ended up, we were aiming to do about 80 sessions because 90 was a bit tough last time, but we ended up around 88 and possibly one or two more as well. So the number has not decreased significantly. We've had more than 150 partners, so a lot of the sessions were co-hosted by quite a few other partners. And interestingly, even though the host was located in one part of the globe, almost every session had people participating from across the globe, from different time zones. So, they were genuinely global events, each and every one of them, even though they may have been hosted from an organization in one particular part of the globe or one particular country. And so far, we've got well over 20 countries represented. We'll have the full statistics after we finish, and we'll go through the numbers, but these are sort of tentative numbers for now. Next slide, please. Just to give you a flavor of how many people we've had participating, there's well over 1,150 participants that have been participating in the event so far. You'll see the dots are quite well distributed across the globe. We have quite a few in Australia, in the Far East, and then obviously a huge number in South Asia, particularly Bangladesh, and then quite a few in Africa, and quite densely packed in Europe. That's good to see. And then also quite well represented in North America, and this time also in South America, which was something we weren't able to get into because of language difficulties last time. And in fact, one of the lessons we learned was that many people, particularly local adapters, as the theme is on locally led adaptation and resilience, the local adapters tend to speak their own language and are not quite fluent in English or even in French or Spanish. And so we went out of our way to enable people to speak in their own language, like Marathi or Swahili or Urdu. And we arranged this time from our side the interpreters to enable them to do that. And that worked out quite well. We've had quite a few sessions. We also did some in Spanish, entirely in Spanish for the Spanish speakers. That worked out very well. If you look at the cities that got the biggest ratings, we got obviously Dhaka. We still get a lot of people from Dhaka, but also Cape Town, Amsterdam, Bangalore in India, Nairobi in East Africa, Islington, which is a part of London. I'm sure there must be other parts of London that will add up to bigger number for London as a whole. And then we have Phnom Penh in Cambodia and Oxford in the UK. So quite a good distribution of participants from around the world, which, in my view, it demonstrates the branding of the event globally. The people in this world of adaptation to climate change, I think now know Gobeshona. The word Gobeshona itself is a brand, and they know about the conference, and they participate in the conference quite regularly. And so we've managed to expand our coverage and our participation. Next slide, please. So just to mention a few of the different kinds of sessions we had a whole bunch of thematic sessions on themes like deltas, for example, quite a few different sessions on different deltas. We had urban sessions on cities and urban issues, particularly slum dwellers issues and urban vulnerable groups. We had sessions on mountains, mountain ecosystems, and similarly other major ecosystems as well. So a set of ecosystem-led thematic ones. Then we had sessions on research and communicating research, some very, very innovative ones on storytelling and poetry and visual means of doing research, but then communicating research to the grassroots people, to ordinary people who don't read scientific papers, but who still can use the information in a form, if it's given to them in a form that they can actually use it. So a lot of emphasis on doing good research, but making that research available to the local adapters around the world. And those were some very, very good sessions as well. And then we also had a number of purely networking sessions, not things that talking about issues, but networks of groups. We had a women's group, Waru Commission did. We had slum dweller groups. We had waste picker groups from around the world who were primarily networking amongst similar professional types of people working at the grassroots level, who are now increasingly understanding the climate change issue, getting involved in climate change adaptation at the local level, and sharing their knowledge and experience across the globe. So even though our theme is locally led adaptation, and every location is very different, nevertheless, we had a lot of sharing of experiences across boundaries, across countries, across continents even, and found a significant commonality of interest, even if the circumstances were very different. Deltas are similar across the world, whether it's the Nile Delta or the Ganges Delta or the Vietnam Mekong Delta, etc. Similarly, mountain ecosystems and urban settings have a lot of similarities. So people working in those kinds of ecosystems had a lot of information to share with each other and knowledge to share with each other, which we found very, very stimulating. And then we also had a catalytic grants initiative, which we started last year. We got some funding from the Climate Justice Resilience Fund to offer small grants. These are $5,000 grants to a group of people. The condition was it wasn't just one single group, but 2 or 3 groups coming together and joining forces to do something. So networking, promoting networking and collaboration across networks. And last year we were able to give out a number of these grants. The grantees, we just had their session, in fact, a little while ago. They just finished before this one. The grantees from last year presented their work, some very interesting work there. And we are also having another round of grants this year. And we are keeping the granting process, the application process, open for a few more days because people are still learning about this grant opportunity. And once we close it in the next few days, we will then use our HOVA platform, where we've got more than 1,000 people registered, to actually look at the applications and vote on them. And then the top 5 groups or applications, we will then fund them for $5,000 each. That money will include 1 or 2 people being able to go to COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt in November, and we'll expect them to report back next year at the 3rd Gobeshona conference early next year, where we hope that they will all have some good success stories to share with us. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I'm going to focus a little bit on something that took place over the last year in the run-up to COP26, which was the high-level climate champions from COP25, Gonzalo Muñoz, and the high-level climate champion from COP26, Mr. Nigel Topping, who remains high-level climate champion until COP27. Gonzalo Muñoz has retired from that position, although he's still very active. And we now have a new high-level climate champion from Egypt for COP27, who unfortunately originally we had hoped he would join us live, but he isn't able to join us live. But we hope to get a video from him later and be able to interact with him. But what happened last year was the high-level climate champions started 2 major campaigns. They had a Race to Zero campaign, which engaged with city mayors and CEOs of companies, and I'm sure everybody has seen many offers to come to zero by 2060, by 2050, by 2040, by 2030 even. The quicker they can get to zero, the better. And that has kicked off a very big global campaign of many different actors. These are non-state actors, which is the mandate of the high-level climate champions. At the same time, they also have a separate campaign called Race to Resilience, which is more focused on resilience building, and in particular focuses on the more vulnerable people. And Sheila Patel, who is the founder of the Slum Dwellers International, is our other guest in this session today. And I had the privilege of being appointed as ambassadors for the Race to Resilience with Gonzalo Muñoz and Nigel Topping. And one of the things that was a very successful initiative was the creation of the Resilience Hub. So the Resilience Hub, if we can have the first slide, first part of the slide, the Resilience Hub was a pavilion, very nice location in Glasgow, in COP26 venue. As you entered the venue, it was a very nice location, meeting spaces on the ground floor for people to mingle and meet and have nice coffee. And then on the first floor, there was a seminar room where we had continuous seminars, one after the other. And we did these seminars obviously with people who were in Glasgow participating in person, but we also went out of our way to engage in the hybrid format that we nowadays have with people from all over the world. So Sheila, for example, was not in Glasgow. I was. She participated in quite a few events online. And we also had satellite virtual events taking place around the world. And my center did one for South Asia that were feeding in. So this was a truly hybrid concept that we test ran in Glasgow, and it worked very, very well. We were able to have a lot of networking activities take place, and some big initiatives also announced at the Resilience Hub of a number of groups that came together to announce actual action initiatives as well. So building on that experience, we are expecting and hoping that we will take it to COP27 and do another Resilience Hub in COP27. The arrangements are now being discussed and promoted. Next slide, please. And we are hoping that in COP27, we will be able to build on the success of the Resilience Hub in COP26 and aim for even being a bit more ambitious in terms of what we hope to achieve. And I will use that segue to our involvement with COP27 Resilience Hub as one of the very concrete ways in which the COP 27 activities taking place there, and the Gobeshona activities taking place in the last 6 days, we will link them up. Many of our Gobeshona participants will probably be going to Sharm el Sheikh. Those who are physically there will be able to participate in COP27, and we can start initiating opportunities to hold events there. And those who are not able to go to Sharm el Sheikh will still be able to participate, and we will be looking at ways in which we can ensure their participation in the COP27 Resilience Hub. So that ends my my presentation part of this session. I'll now move on to the interactive conversations part and introduce our main speaker for this session, Mr. Nigel Topping, whom I've referred to already several times. So Nigel, I'm going to kick off with the first question for you, and then I'll ask Sheila, introduce Sheila, and then ask her to ask you a question as well. And then we'll take it from there and have it more in a conversational style rather than a hard talk Q&A type approach. So building on the conversation we just had of the COP26 Race to Resilience success, I think that was a great success myself. I spent a lot of my time at the Resilience Hub in Glasgow. The coffee was very nice, I must say. That was a tremendous good stroke of genius in getting people to meet up there. But I would say my one, if you like, slight frustration was that whereas we did a lot of good networking and a lot of announcements of activities by non-state actors and sharing of information and activities and networking, we were not really able, in my view, to get inside the negotiating track. The negotiators were all behind closed doors, inaccessible to us, although one or two occasionally would come out and talk at an event, but then they'd go back into the negotiations. And with the results of the negotiations, in many ways are quite disappointing. And I felt we were not able to penetrate inside the negotiation. Now, given that you as high-level champions are official mandated individuals from the COP, to talk to non-state actors and to bring their messages into the COP process, I'd like your thoughts on how we can do that better going forward between now and by the time we get to Sharm el Sheikh in November this year. Nigel, over to you.
Thank you, Salim. First of all, thanks. It's great to meet you, and I think that what you have created, but what you're now creating as a brand and an expectation annually of this big virtual gathering is really impressive and really important. And I'm really pleased to see that the way you keep evolving it, like taking consideration of the need to be much more flexible in terms of languages, right? That seems to me one of the mistakes that is often made, to only do things in English, which is just, hugely biases against hugely important stakeholder groups, particularly around resilience. One little thing, Salim, a little improvement. I noticed you're using a Mercator's projection map of the world. Mm-hmm. You've got to change that. It makes the Nordics look bigger than India, which is ridiculous, right?
Yeah. So agreed. Noted.
So I think, look, first of all, I really agree, and I want to really thank you and Sheila for pushing and encouraging me and Gonzalo to launch the Race to Resilience, to make it people-centric. For all the partners who came together around the Resilience Hub, I agree. I think it's a really important innovation, and we must, just like you've built on Gobeshona, we must build on that. I think actually Resilience Hub did some things which are really quite unique, and that I would like to see others, like having not just the hub within the Blue Zone, but also a partner in Glasgow Caledonian University outside, so more people join. And then, as you say, the virtual hub. So there's a lot of things that are really important, because it seems to me, and I'll come to your question in a minute, but I'm just sort of trying to organize my thoughts, that our big challenge here is to find a way to marry the need for local input and local delivery of finance and local context with scale, because that's the challenge, right? Is normally when we try and do scale, we say, okay, put a lot of money in at the top, and then we know it doesn't get to the bottom. So we have inappropriate solutions or maladaptation, or we don't get flow of finance. But if we only do things locally, then also the transaction costs are so high that it's very hard to ever add things up to get to scale. So That's what I'm grappling with. It's not like a technology play where we just try and
Mhm.
get everyone to move to green hydrogen or electric vehicles. So there's less context specificity, but we do have to find a way to get to scale still, because we can't
Yeah.
afford to do one small community at a time. We have to find a way to really aggregate. So in a couple of thoughts in terms of how do we, I mean, I just draw on my own experience of trying to input into the negotiation process when I was leading We Mean Business in Paris. And I think there's two things here. One, to recognize that a lot of stuff happens outside of the negotiation process, and that's fine. That's kind of what, and we should drive that. And that means these coalitions of cities and grassroots and philanthropy and some countries, but that are not unanimous. So we shouldn't pretend that that's not helpful, and we should keep driving that. I think in terms of influencing negotiations, it's just you just need to be really forensic about what are you trying to influence, and try and get the biggest possible coalition to share the same messages, so that negotiators from as many countries as possible hear the same thing. So I think that of course there are the tracks on the global goal and adaptation, and on moving forward the conversation around loss and damage. And there I think one thing I think it's really important is I'll give you an example. Just to call for a big fund on loss and damage isn't helpful to anybody, I don't think. You have to be precise and say, what will the nature of the fund be? Who will pay into it? How much? Why? What will the nature of it? How will it pay out? To whom? For what? When? Because those are the details which will actually be negotiated. So it's easy to agree or talk at generalities, but negotiators deal with lines of text. But I also think then there are some there's a real opportunity now with the global stock take, which I think is an opportunity to influence many national governments without going through a top-down negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
So and one thing I'm really keen to do is make sure that we, the high-level champions, so me and Mahmoud, who by the way is very, very committed to this agenda of building resilience in the more vulnerable countries, and I'm really sorry that he can't join us. He's got that, he's got 3 jobs at least at the moment. So but we can come back to talk about him in Egypt in a minute. So I think it's really worth us thinking about how do we really focus the input of all of you, the resilience community, through the office of the high level champion. I mean, you can input. But it's going to be a real challenge for the parties to make sense of everyone's going to throw stuff at them, and so if you're not careful, the global stock take just becomes as confusing as the world is. We have to try and find a way to converge some of the messaging. So I was interested. You were talking about the way you ran the sessions. I think similarly the way that we've organised our thinking and our narrative around the race to resilience, around the slum dwellers, the urban poor, super vulnerable to heat stress and to floods, because they lack the roof over our heads, as Sheila would say. They lack the basic infrastructure, and then the smallholder farmers, and then the coastal dwellers, so deltas and rivers, and they have some overlapping needs, but there's some. I think we have to find a way to be more specific about saying these are the 3 or 4 big things that each of these communities need. And of course, you can't ever sum up the needs of a vulnerable community in 3 or 4 headlines. But I think if we don't even try, then we lose new partners in trying to be so complex and complete. So we're better off simplifying the story to engage people and say, so they can start to imagine themselves being part of the solution. And as people get in, of course, everything is super complex. But so I think my feeling is not to put all our eggs in the negotiated outcomes basket, but to try and get as crisp and as aligned about to see the global stock take as a real bridge, and an opportunity to positively influence that, and then to keep on going with the kind of multi-stakeholder collaborations that we're getting better at, but that we still need to go a lot further with.
Great, thank you very much, Nigel. Also, I think to pick up on your point that both the Gobeshona conferences, we don't see them as one-off events. We see them as a series going forward over time and improving and evolving over time. And I think the link to the Resilience Hub also being a similar process. We'd go from COP26 to COP27 and then again COP28, and each time evolve and get better at aggregating all of these voices into coherent messages that can be portrayed at the global level, as you said. I'm now going to invite Sheila Patel, who does not need any introduction to the Gobeshona world. She's one of our greatest champions, the founder of Slum Dwellers International and also of Spark in India. Sheila, over to you. You get the next question or comment and question to Nigel.
So Nigel, your issue about scale and your issue about measurement are things that have obsessed all of us. And we are actually looking for ways by which we can literally capitalize on the fact of the aggregation of vulnerable groups as identities that bring many, many locals to a global idea or thought. You have Slum Dwellers International, that's 300 cities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You multiply that with the number of millions who've been doing this together. Same thing with, all the different movements that are there. And I think that all of us who were mainly in the development space and now are looking at the climate dimensions of the choices that we have, we come with lots of aspirations into the climate space, but with deep frustration, because most of the people who provide funds do not look at the climate dimensions of development investments, which are very critical for very vulnerable groups across, And so one of the things we find is that we are not able to move from what would be, some disasters and some disastrous aid into powerful, resilient solutions, because there's no recognition of the need for poor people to drive it. And there is not enough conversation about the scale and the time frame. And although we have the LLA principles that we all champion, which we bring into our work on resilience, we find that both global funders, national governments, private sector companies are not able to look at us as serious allies and partners. And so you have in the past been amazingly supportive. And so we have very high expectations of what we want to do this year. So how can we do that so that we transform our rhetoric into action?
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, I will continue to be an ally for as long as I live, because I formally will step down from this role in December. But as you know, my background has been more on the mitigation side, coming from industry. But the thing that most motivates me now is the structural injustice that is revealed by climate change, and it's much deeper than climate change. I know. So, and that's exactly that. And that's, of course, that's what we're dealing with here, is that there are structural barriers. There are also practical barriers, but the practical barriers are easier to overcome. Well, they would be if there weren't the structural barriers. I think. I think that the what we have to do is find ways. And I do see evidence of, first of all, I think probably led more by the work on mitigation than on resilience so far. We are getting better at collaborating. And I think a bit more humility from everyone, that no one's got a silver bullet. This is too complicated, that there's more than enough work for everybody. So stop some of the competition between NGOs, for example, and better collaboration between different types of NGO. So I think the climate and the conservation NGOs for a long time didn't collaborate very well. They're getting better. I think, as you say, Sheila, this is a climate, gender, poverty, development nexus issue. So I think one of the things we have to do, and this is where we're having locally led adaptation principles and local voices is so crucial, is to make sure that things are community and country led, not imposed from an external view which is ignorant of the local context, or informed by some received view. I think we have to find a way to, in big initiatives which are seeking to drive change at scale, to build in some of those principles and recognize that. So, for example, I'm at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, or there's a global mangrove alliance, and I'm thinking, because Egypt and the UAE and Saudi, so this Middle Eastern region, have a lot of money and a lot of mangroves. I'm thinking, could we do a global mangrove restoration initiative? So there's lots of work going on, but have it one which attracts more attention, more government support, philanthropic support, but build into that the locally led principles, so that although there's a global structure and program, it's working with it's always working with local partners. It's not people from my country and the USA coming in and telling people what to do. There may be some, like I know in the Emirates, that they're working with the Zoological Society of London, who have some real scientific experts. But great, so you have some. It's not that we don't want to collaborate, but it needs to be not imposed. So I think. So I think it's about really trying to say, and this is kind of where I think Mahmoud is going. As my new partner, about, okay, we've got all the high level commitments. This has got to be all be about how do we projectize things and package them so they're really happening. So I'm starting to think that in all of the race resilience work, I want to look at everything, whether it's the roof over our heads, or urban water infrastructure, or clean cooking stoves, or mangrove restoration, all of which, of course, have development, gender, mitigation, and adaptation benefits, right? So again, it's not just one thing. That's good, right? I mean, you're investing once and getting 4 benefits. So those are the sort of things we should be looking at. I think so I think I'm starting to think that we as the champion should say, like, we want to see, for each of these, really bold initiatives which are aiming to mobilize, not just, I like to say, not just as much funding as we think we dare ask for, but that we actually need to solve the problem. I think that's one of the problems with the 100 billion, right? It's not based in what do we need to solve the problem, so it's a sort of random figure. And I think we need to engineer back more from what's the problem, like how many hectares of mangroves do we need to restore, how much will it cost, is there a way of making that investable in any way, how do we do it? So I think let's try and be bolder. And then let's build in some of the sort of execution principles, which include that there has to be local partners. Otherwise, we'll have maladaptation. And then let's be honest about whether we've got, is there anything? So what I'm thinking is, in the race to resilience, if you take the 3 kind of communities we mentioned, if we could simplify the narrative, and again, I know this is an oversimplification, but I think in order to bring in lots more funders and private sector and public sector leaders, you have to simplify so you can explain quickly, and then sometimes just bite your tongue about knowing that it's actually, life is much more complicated than that, because if you try and explain life, then you never, even in a 100-story building, right, you never get out of the elevator. So I'm sort of thinking, if we could say that here's the 4 things that are the most important for smallholder farmers, I don't know, like, solar powered irrigation, crop insurance, access to markets, and I don't know. I'm not the expert, but we're starting with our expert review group based in Santiago with this global network to think a bit about that, and then say, okay, what's the state, and put this into the stock take. Okay, so if mangroves is one of them, we've got some nice initiatives, but there's nowhere that you can see that has actually got enough momentum to drive the whole chain. So and maybe there's some good initiatives, but they're not locally considering the local. I don't know. Somehow to do an assessment of how well we're doing, so that we can be then more forensic about what do we need to change and how do we get each COP improve, so that, as you say, we're not lurching from COP to COP, but on each of these issues, every COP we're trying to go faster and faster and faster. Maybe
we also need your help to get people who don't speak to each other to talk to each other. We slum dwellers, we don't talk to scientists. So when you talk about maladaptation, you have to bring that knowledge into common talk to say, that's not good. No, we shouldn't invest in that, because that's dysfunctional. The other thing is, when experience grassroots.
Sorry, I just lost you, Sheila. You said that's not good, we shouldn't invest, and I lost you.
I'm saying that, if we need to get people who don't generally are in the same room together, So you get scientists, you get slum dwellers and activists, you get finance people, you get, the idea is that you meet all of them, but we don't meet all of them.
Yeah,
So
and I think
this would be fantastic.
I think that's a really good idea. But I think we need to do that around a focused enough scope so that everyone, so that because just some of the things I've been looking at, like some of the work on, let's say, clean cooking stoves,
Yeah.
Or open waste burning, which again another thing which is both emissions and health.
Yes. Health
issues.
Yes.
So it's narrow enough so that because if the site very few people will be able to contribute to open waste burning and mangroves and clean cook stoves and energy access. But I agree we need the sort of the grassroots mobilizers and the scientists and the financiers and the sort of local governments and the private sector. So I think maybe that's something we need to do around these. As I say, when we simplify the narrative, so these are the four biggest solution areas for slum dwellers, say, Sheila. Let's start regularly convening a conversation that moves forward and building a community so that, and as you say, Helen, not kid ourselves that we're going to solve the problem by the time we get to Sharm el Sheikh, but say we're trying to build momentum and clarity and alignment so that over 3 to 5 years, we're building a momentum so that we're solving the problem this decade. I mean, I think that's a bit more humble and realistic given the complexity.
The other thing we'd like you and the other champion to do is to put us in touch with more people who are working on the ground in the MENA region. MENA region is the least represented in all our networking somehow. We shouldn't all be parachuting into Sharm el Sheikh without the local non-state actors also being there, or their voices being there. And I think we hold it as a very serious responsibility to make sure that between now and November, we all work together to engage them, to get to know them, to be able to, to see them, because it's terrible to have a process in which all these outsiders are coming in and there aren't enough local voices,
Yeah.
So that would be.
Well, I've just come back from the first MENA Climate Week, and it was fantastic because it was like so 80% people from the region, and there were people like me who maybe with global roles or people are trying to support the process. And of course, there's a different flavor of conversation than a COP or a Latin American or an Asian or an African one, because there are specific around heat stress and water stress, right? And so we actually did an implementation workshop with the Marrakesh partners around water infrastructure with young with youth leaders and local NGOs. And so I think we have to find a way, and Salim, you're the same way that you're building your skill at convening with Gobeshona. I think that maybe, Sheila, I maybe just need to be bolder about inviting. I mean, we can always get it wrong, right? There's no, but let's get it. Let's fail trying. I think that was one of Obama's things. Sometimes it's more, if we're gonna fail, let's fail trying, not fail fluffing it. So I think we could start to try and convene some conversation, maybe initially around those three groups, like urban, rural, coastal, and then maybe we get more granular around the actual solution sets as we go. And try and so we started doing these like implementation workshops that's kind of the idea about them but we don't need to only do them during the climate weeks, right? We should maybe be doing a regular rhythm of them. I like that idea.
Over to you, Salim.
That's right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nigel. Those were excellent comments. So my next question is something that has come up, although the Gobeshona conference focuses on locally led adaptation and resilience, not necessarily on loss and damage. But we've had a few sessions that brought the topic in, because it is now something that cannot be ignored anymore, particularly after the Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 reports of the IPCC have made it very clear that loss and damage is occurring and happening, and local people are suffering as a result of it. And so what are the ways? You've already mentioned that we have in the Glasgow agreement, we have the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. Agreed, that's a good thing. We wish that to succeed and move forward quickly. We had hoped to get a Glasgow facility on finance. We didn't get that, but we got a Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage. Let's see if we can use that dialogue constructively going forward. And in both of these cases, there will be workshops scheduled in June in Bonn during the subsidiary bodies meeting of the UNFCCC. So one of the things that we plan to do from the Gobeshona work conference is take a few of these items that are relevant for the ongoing negotiation part of the discussions in the Santiago Network and the Glasgow Dialogue, and feed in some of the messages that we are able to do. I plan to go to the DSP in June myself, and others, other partners will be there as well. So we will be looking to join forces in June in SP, so we can start conversations with the actual negotiators who are going to have to make the decisions, and then continue conversations with them going forward to Sharm el Sheikh. And in parallel to the negotiation space, as you're quite well aware, in Glasgow, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, started the ball rolling on actually financing something. She started with £1 million and then doubled it by the end of the COP. It's not a huge amount, but it is more than anybody else was offering. And so she started the ball rolling, and has got other supporters putting more money in, and that ball is now beginning to roll as well. So is there something we can think of with non-state actors to take this issue forward? And you mentioned specific things, that we show what we're talking about, and not just the principle of, we want polluters to pay, etc. That has limited traction and doesn't attract a lot of support. But practical things, and how can we take that forward? I know you participated in the dialogue that the Scottish government organised a month or so ago as well.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about this, because I think it seems to be one of those areas that we've got a bit stuck in a polarized conversation, which to some feels like they're just being asked to sign a blank check, and to others it feels like all they're asking for is the injustice of their situation to be recognised and to be helped. I mean, so it seems so I understand why that's got polarised, and I think the only way when you get that kind of polarisation is to get practical. Because I think one of the issues, frankly, is that I don't think there's clarity about what different vulnerable communities mean by help with losses and damages. So, for example, I think the Caribbean islands have a very particular issue, that they are small economies, and when they get hit, they get losses which are of the same order of magnitude as the country's GDP, which just means they've got a massive indebtedness trap, and they don't get relief from that. Whereas some of them, and I'm simplifying, of course, but I'm trying to think in terms of some archetypes to help understand. Whereas there's quite a few Pacific countries where the issue's really much more the slow onset, that they're losing their home. That's very different than a sort of and then I think some of the bigger, more populated countries, it's different again in terms of how do we remove some of the volatility which makes investing in development really, really hard. So that's first thought, is that we need to be specific about there's some different types of losses that need to be catered for in different ways. I think also we need to be honest that actually the world's very sophisticated at dealing with risks and losses in many cases. Like we have, in some cases, we have very good risk sharing and risk pooling mechanisms across countries and across communities that have evolved over the years. When we had the fire of London and everyone, then you start to get the emergence of insurance. And so, and sometimes that's entirely private, sometimes that's socialized. Like, in the UK, all of our healthcare is free at the point of use because it's 100% socialized. Whereas, if I want to borrow money to buy a house, I have to show that I've got house insurance, because that means all of the houses basically are insured. So the risk is shared. So I think we also need to look at I think there are also areas where we're terrible. Like I was just speaking to some people from the World Food Programme. We don't have a kind of immediate responsibility to mobilize finance for. We seem to wait for a disaster and then ask for money and then mobilize it too little, too late. So I'm not saying that we, but I do think that looking at where we've got good mechanisms for risk sharing and reducing the risk burden, Because the more I think about this, it's the volatility of not. So if you're a farmer, I think I've done some research. Futures contracts, which seemed like an esoteric financial market, derivative players, they were developed in Japan to provide rice farmers with stability of income. If you don't know whether you're going to get 10 units or 1 unit for your rice, you can't invest. So I mean, I know my brother-in-law is a farmer, and he sells forward. So he will have sold wheat 6 months ago at a much lower price than he could get now. But for him, it was worth it because it meant he knew what he was getting, so he could borrow money for the next tractor. So I think we have to look at some of the mechanisms that work. And when I went to the Caribbean to try and understand this resilience issue from a perspective of small islands last year, I learned a lot about some of the work they're doing on rolling out more of what they call parametric insurance, and that's often subsidized by a rich country, but not fully, because otherwise you have a sort of moral hazard. If someone provides you with insurance and you have no skin in the game, then you have no incentive to avoid the risk. So and what that does, it pays out immediately when a certain parameter is hit, like a wind speed or a level of flooding. So it gets resources locally very quickly. So locally and quickly is really important, right? Not locally and a year later after you've argued, just ground everyone down, they've had to sell their assets. So for example, one of the partners in the Race to Resilience, Insure Resilience, is aiming to extend coverage to 500 million people who don't have insurance cover in the world, in vulnerable communities, by 2025, and they're making quite good progress. And I think the German G7 presidency are really seeing this as something that they need to promote. And so Salim, I think something will have to be resolved within the UNFCCC, but I think this is something where we should look more broadly at other things that are happening that address the need to provide more resilience in the face of inevitable losses. And so I think of it as, I think the overall framing generally is, prevent, reduce, and then deal with when they actually happen. So I think prevention is really about the race to zero, going as fast as we can, and some of the early warning stuff. And here I think Bangladesh is an amazing success story, right, of getting organized about early warning. It's massively reduced. I mean, you should remind people of the numbers. It's an unbelievable reduction in human lives lost in cyclone events because you've got really organized. And then we need to invest. So I think one of the things, and this goes back to the finance, Sheila, is there's been some really good work done by the Coalition for Climate Resilient Infrastructure, but I think they've mainly been thinking more about sort of traditional like urban infrastructure, like power and roads and stuff. But what they've been looking at is how do you use the fact that investing in resilience leads to a better macroeconomic outcome, but which may not be a cash flow. That's the difficulty. It's not like if you plant mangroves, you don't necessarily, I mean, maybe if you can do some blue carbon deals, but what you do is you reduce the losses in the future every time there's so I think we need to find ways to make that reduced future financial loss to a community something which is investable. I don't think we've cracked that yet.
I think that's also something which is happening, because everything today is related to, all the GDP growth is related to carbon. If you want to reduce carbon, then you need to replace the calculations of projections and present thing, with something else,
Well, no, I think it's a real problem that when the world's markets assess the creditworthiness of a country or a city, I think that the fundamental logic is flawed in that there's a sort of background assumption that things carry on as normal as an extension of the past. Whereas the background assumption should be things get much worse.
Much worse, exactly.
And so if that was the background assumption, then somebody's got a plan to deal with that. That itself should attract a better credit rating. So, and that's the other thing I've been thinking, is that these issues of losses and debt, which we talked about offline before we started, are all, and how to drive investment in emerging markets are all interlinked. I mean, if you're getting if you're having lots of losses that are uncovered, and in emerging and developing markets, climate losses are only insured 1 to 4%, and in developed countries it's 40 to 50. So if you're losing then you're getting more in debt, and if you get more in debt, then it's harder to borrow money. If it's harder to borrow money, it's harder to invest. So it's this vicious cycle. Trap, and we have to try and break into it in the losses, in the debt, and in the investment. All three of them, I think. And it's really hard because people have been trying to mobilize development finance well for a long time. So I think that's an area. The only thing I think is different now is we've got more urgency from more people, and the private sector is trying to figure out how it can play a role. So I hope that those two things mean that we can innovate faster.
Great, thank you very much. Before we end, I'd like to, touch upon something of significant urgency that's come up, as if we didn't have things bad enough with the COVID crisis and the climate crisis. We now have the Ukraine war crisis, which is upsetting global systems that we have become used to, and actually is very relevant to the climate change question. On the one side, the dependence on fossil fuels of Europe is a complicating factor in dealing with Russian aggression. And on the other hand, the grain markets of the world, primarily coming from Ukraine and Russia, are going to be affected in a very big way. And countries like Bangladesh, for example, I didn't realize this until the war broke out, that we import most of our wheat for our chapatis that we eat from Ukraine. And the prices have already gone up. And so this is now going to percolate into the system in a very bad way, in my view. So we need to be thinking, again, more boldly and innovatively going forward. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, of course, I have thoughts, but they're swirling around because it's so hard to grapple with the magnitude of the crisis, both at a human level, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, but then, as you say, Salim, then the knock-on effects. So, I mean, it's far too early to tell, but I think that it looks like certainly in Europe and the UK, then the shock is accelerating the move towards renewables. So you could say that's a positive consequence. It's also very clear that it's triggering a massive commodity price spike, particularly food, as you say. And Egypt, so I'm following closely because we're partnering, have, I think, guaranteed the price of bread, because similarly they eat a lot of bread, but they import most of their wheat.
Mm-hmm.
But the government guaranteeing the price means the government is just taking on more and more and more debt. So and Mahmoud, actually, who's the incoming champion, my fellow champion, he's a former investment minister. He's a PhD in economics. He's been working at the World Bank and the IMF. So he really knows the debt issue very well. And in fact, just the day he was announced, he published an article saying, we have a debt management problem. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, in the private sector, we have this idea of managed debt restructuring. In America, they call it Chapter 11, where you can say, look, I've got a problem. I can't pay all my debts, but I don't want to go bankrupt. I think we can restructure it. We can come to an arrangement with our creditors. But meantime, I'm going to carry on trading. But in the international domain, it doesn't happen. So there's a common framework which the World Bank has tried to put forward, but it's, again, I'm an amateur here, but I'm learning that the countries who've gone in 4 years later still haven't come out the other end. And all that time, of course, it's very hard to borrow money or move forward. So I think we've got a real big issue internationally that we have to find a better way to restructure debt when it becomes crippling, and it's getting worse for a lot more countries. And the other, but on a more positive note, I think we saw some examples last year of debt for nature or debt for climate swaps in two very vulnerable countries, Seychelles and Belize, who were able to wipe off about half of their overseas debts in exchange for commitments to take action on climate. And that, I wonder whether that's a scalable model, right? Those two quite small countries, but I think we need to look at those three areas of losses and insurance, debt restructuring, debt for nature swap, as well as the investment needs, because they're all interlinked.
Absolutely. Great. We're coming towards the end of our allocated time. So I'd like to thank Nigel for making the time to be with us. I hope we'll be able to continue conversations with Mahmoud Mohieldin in the coming weeks and months, going towards COP27 as well. But before we close, I'll ask both Sheila and Nigel for some concluding thoughts. So first Sheila and then Nigel.
Well, Salim, this journey of exploring climate began when I first came to see you. I think we met when we were in Madrid, really. And it very quickly absorbed all my intellectual energies. And it's an amazing journey, lots of frustrations, lots of expectations. But clearly, as we have seen in the building of the movement of slum dwellers, in 1996, when we began to think of doing what we're doing in India, in South Africa, everybody was laughing at us. And they said, it can't be done. And today we have 33 countries and 300 cities who are following the same process. So I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of belief in people's innate commitment to make life change for themselves, especially for women, for their children.
Mhm.
So I feel very grateful that I have found this community and all of you. And so we can hang on each other's shoulders while we try to grapple with the things in our own backyards and support each other. And Gobeshona is a good way to kickstart the year. And I truly hope that when we come to Sharm el-Sheikh, we will have evolved to another level of understanding, of action, of solidarity, and of real change that we can visibly take back to our local constituency. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sheila. Nigel, any final thoughts from your side?
I mean, first of all, just thank you for continuing to involve me in the conversation. I mean, I feel like I'm on a very steep learning curve, and it doesn't show any sign of stopping, because every time I have a conversation, I realize there's more I don't know. I really appreciate the way that you've made this a global event. Although I would really like to come and visit Dakar and see some of the work that you've done on the ground there. So
you must come.
Yeah. Just a few thoughts. I think, and I really agree with Sheila's point about evolving. And so I think we must be both impatient and patient with ourselves. Like, we're not going to. These we're talking about intertwined, complex issues of development, of injustices across multiple dimensions, of the complexities of the climate system and the global economy. So it's about as complicated as you can get. For me, the exciting thing is that the urgency of climate might be a motive force to address some other injustices, right? But I like the idea of evolving, Sheila, and therefore I think. But being both every year being impatient about what we try to deliver at the COP, but also, as Gonzalo said it I think best in Glasgow, he said, when you look at the photo, like the still photograph, you almost always get either angry or frustrated or sad, because it shows just how bad the situation is. But when you look at the movie of how we're evolving, as you've just done, Sheila, looking back at the evolution of Sunbirds International, that can be a real source of hope. And I think we need to do both. We need to remind ourselves of the facts, and we need to then also remind ourselves of how capable we are of progressing, even if we're only like a tenth of the way there. That's the basic idea behind Cristiana Figueres's podcast, Outrage and Optimism. We should be outraged, but not get stuck there. And then we look at what we can do. I think I'm more and more thinking we need to find a way to really kind of simplify the narrative around here. The 3 or 4 things that need to be delivered for those 3 archetypal communities that we've described in the Race to Resilience. And I love the idea of using the convening power of the champions to bring together a broader ecosystem of people who maybe aren't aware enough of each other, don't talk to each other. And again, we can get that wrong, but let's at least get it wrong trying, right? We may find we try and do it for the urban issues, and we might immediately find we need to separate that into water, power, roofs, and then go park. I don't know, but let's try something. And then I think the magic source is going to be how we get the scale, the ambition and mobilization at scale to meet the local. And this may be a surprising source of inspiration. I've just come back from the Emirates, and I went to visit Saudi Arabia. I've never been to Saudi Arabia, so I have a very old idea of what the country's like, and it's changing very, very fast. And it seems the general census I have from people there is the reason it's changing fast is you've got a very clear top-down vision of a much more open society, and so the role, women, who couldn't drive a car 5 years ago or go out without a chaperone now can do both those things. And they just had a massive rave in the desert with 120,000 young Saudis dancing the night away for 4 nights. So it's things that you never would have believed happening are happening. But there's this combination of a grassroots push for change with a top-down mandate for change. And I think, given some of the things we've seen in mayors and regional governments committing to really drive an ambitious program on climate change, I think if we can get the kind of local government, grassroots organizations, and then some of the international finance and NGO support, that's the sort of secret recipe that we're going to have to unlock, I think. So I'm really excited to be working with you.
Start cooking it.
The road to Sharm el-Sheikh. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you very much, Nigel and Sheila, for sharing your thoughts and being part of this exercise. So before I conclude, let me just share a couple of thoughts from my side in terms of where do we go from here, and build on the conversations we've had and the discussions that we've had over these nearly 90 sessions in Gobeshona. So we will distill some of them, and Nigel, you're quite right. We have to be very focused in what it is that we think we have to say of relevance in the different arenas that we'll be taking forward, particularly in the UNFCCC process to COP27, but also outside the process. And in particular, your role as the designated champions to deal with non-state actors. I see tremendous opportunity there. And, you and Gonzalo have started the ball rolling with the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience. Sometimes I envy the fact that the Race to Zero seems to have a lot more publicity and recognition than the Race to Resilience does. So I'd like us to also catch up with them. And in the Race to Resilience, the configuration is somewhat different. It isn't CEOs of companies making commitments. It is local people doing things and being recognized for doing things. And that we still don't have. We still have a very top-down, stakeholder mapping of who the relevant stakeholders are. And then the local people come as an afterthought, or, the so-called beneficiaries. You're thinking of us, but you're not involving us in the discussion. All right. So let's bridge that gap and be better at it. And your convening power as the high-level champions is ideal for that. You don't need to worry about the negotiations. You need to worry about the practice, the problems that are being faced, and find out all the allies that we can bring around tables for specific actions. And I agree with you entirely. The more specific we can be, the more effective we will be. The more general we are, the less effective we will be. And so being a few, and we can't do everything, so let's pick a few that we think are doable and then put some energy into bringing together the right constituencies to try and solve problems and go into solving the problem rather than endlessly describing the problem. So thank you very much, both Sheila and Nigel, for being with me and joining us for this concluding session of the second Global Gobeshona Conference on Locally Led Adaptation and Resilience. And this closes the entire 6-day-long session for everybody. We will be sharing the recordings. A lot of people, we've already started sharing recordings of the first few sessions, and people are already watching them. So it's not over. We'll put everything up on YouTube on the Gobeshona channel, and we'll publicize them. And so people who weren't able to join the live events, who may be interested in watching the recordings, will be able to watch them as well. So with that, I declare the second Gobeshona conference closed. And thank you all very much. Thank you.